Happy Wednesday, SciCommers, and welcome to this month's Mentor Chat. Today, I'm pleased to introduce y'all to Jane Hu. Jane writes the Microdose, a twice weekly newsletter about psychedelics, and blogs at the Last Word on Nothing. And this Mentor Chat will be all about newsletters. And to continue the thread from our Mentor Chat on blogs, this is a great opportunity for you to see the different avenues and ways that you can get your SciComm out there to the people. And a great opportunity to ask about the differences between those two mediums. And so right now we will give the floor to Jane. And again, thank you all for coming.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. Really glad to be able to chat a little bit about newsletters, which is something that I guess I'll say up front as a caveat, I don't feel like I'm an expert on, but I am very glad to be able to share what I have learned along the way. So I guess outside of writing a newsletter, most of my work as a freelance journalist is more kind of general. I found that the newsletter that I'm working on currently, which is called the Microdose, it's about the science and kind of politics around psychedelics, that is really focused on a specific beat. And that has been kind of a great joy of mine as more of a generalist science journalist, being able to really dive in deeply on a specific beat has been super fun. So I kind of want to start about talking about my history with newsletters. While I was sitting down and thinking about what I wanted to tell you all about, I realized that I've actually had 3 newsletters over the course of my career, and they have served very different purposes. And I'm hoping that talking about each of them will give you all a little bit to think about in terms of what you all want to get out of an experience of starting a newsletter, if you do want to start a newsletter. So the first I started was in conjunction with my friend Shannon Pallas, who is now an editor at Slate. But at the time, it was, I think, 2017. I think it was right after the Trump's inauguration. And we started a newsletter called Do a Thing. Both of us were feeling somewhat helpless and like our voices were not being heard politically. And this was kind of an interesting move for both of us being science journalists, since journalists are told not to take stances on political things. But we felt like this was one way that we could just personally feel like we were contributing something to the world. So we started a newsletter on Tiny Letter. It was called Do a Thing because each day we sent out just one action that people could take that day to make some kind of difference. And that ranged from, like calling senators and, here's info about how to find who your senator is and how to call them, to, do something nice for someone in your community, or here's how to find an organization in your community to take action. And so that newsletter, I think, ended up having several thousand subscribers. And it came in a time when I feel like newsletters were not as zeitgeisty as they are now. Also, at no point did we have any plans to monetize it. That's actually a thread across all of the work I've ever done with newsletters where I have never monetized a newsletter. So I'm happy to talk a little bit about that if folks want to chat about it, but I don't have any particular expertise on that. I'll just throw that out there right away. The second newsletter I started was, I think, in the summer of 2019. It was called Who Cares, who is in my last name. And I started that on Substack just as a way to look at different types of writing and to do a different kind of writing than I usually do. So I think I've only updated it a few times. It was purely a passion project of mine where friends and family, maybe folks I knew from the internet, could subscribe and get a very occasional random missive from me about something in the world. It kind of felt like more of a format of an old school blog where I just got a space to be creative, and that brought me joy. And at no point was I, hoping for 1 million followers or to make money off of it. It was mostly just trying to scratch an itch that I couldn't fill with my usual day job. And then that brings me to the Microdose, which is the third newsletter that I have worked on. So the Microdose is on Substack, and it is supported by the UC Berkeley Center for the Science of Psychedelics. What a nice thing about the Microdose is that we are editorially independent from the rest of the center. So for the most part, I actually don't know what's going on with the center until the rest of the world does. So my editor, Malia Wallen, she is at the UC Berkeley School of Journalism, and both of us are pretty committed to making sure that it is an enterprise that really reports on the news rather than being a communications piece for the center specifically. So I can talk a little bit more about the Microdose later. Maybe I'll slot in details about that work as I'm talking about newsletters in general. But I imagine you're here because you might be interested in starting on a newsletter. And so I wanted to just go over a few things that I would advise thinking about when you're getting started. And the first, I would really say you probably want to think about what the purpose is going to be. You might have already thought about this if you're curious about it. But I feel like often when people talk about newsletters, the implication is that this has to be a professional tool for you. And I don't think that's true. I just want to put out there that I think can also be a personal project of yours that doesn't have to be tied to your professional identity. However, I know a lot of you probably will want to be writing about things related to your day jobs. But I think also asking yourself questions like, what are your other goals with it? Like, are you looking to make money on this? Are you hoping to update people on what you're doing? Like for the way that I felt about Who Cares? Like, are you trying to enter into a different beat? Are you trying to do a different kind of writing than usual? Maybe this is a spinoff from something that you're already working on, like a long-term project or a book where you've discovered something that you don't really have any other place to put, but maybe a newsletter would be a good way to iterate on it for a little bit. Or maybe, again, it could just be for fun. And that is a completely valid reason to start a newsletter as well. So related to that, I really encourage you to think about what success looks like for you. I think often people start a newsletter and you feel like, well, maybe this is going to be the ticket to my career taking off, or maybe this is going to get me work in some abstract way. I remember actually writing a piece for the Open Notebook a few years ago about some folks who had newsletters then. It included Ed Yong, who is now known for great science reporting in general, as he was then. But at the time, Ed had a newsletter called The Ed's Up, where he just included pieces that he had read that week that he liked, and just kind of got to a list of what was up with his own work. But one thing he said really stuck with me, which was, I'm paraphrasing here, but basically that he couldn't really point to any specific thing that had come out of his newsletter, but that he felt like overall it had helped his career and opened doors and made connections. And so I think trying to define what success looks like for you can be really difficult, but I think it's worth sitting down and thinking about. Does success look like your own satisfaction? Does success look like putting things out on a regular schedule and holding yourself to posting weekly or even monthly? Does success look like getting more followers? I think just being really honest with yourself about what you want to get out of it makes it more likely that you're going to feel like you have something to reach towards, because otherwise I think it can become a really amorphous project where you might feel emotionally drained by it, or like you're not sure how much time you want to spend on it. Like, I think that figuring out what your goals are or what success looks like for you from the beginning helps you figure out like how to structure everything else around that newsletter and how much time you want to devote to it. I think another thing you want to think about is big picture, what the content might look like. So one question to ask yourself might be, what do you think, if you're trying to, tell someone about your newsletter, what do you think this adds to people's lives? Like, are they going to be entertained? Are they going to be informed? Both, I guess, ideally both. What also kind of personality or style would you like your newsletter to have? I think with the 3 newsletters that I have worked on over time, each of them have been quite different in terms of the tone and the amount of personality I bring to them. So the Microdose, because it's a little bit more based in reporting, I take a more kind of just dry journalistic voice. I'm kind of giving the facts. Whereas with these other 2 newsletters, Do a Thing and Who Cares, I am quite voicey, because those are spaces in which I feel like people have subscribed to hear what I have to say. And I think that that's often a major draw for newsletters. People are often excited to start a newsletter because maybe you want a place to be a little bit more yourself, to be able to inject voice into whatever project you're writing about in your newsletter. So I think it can really be a chance to showcase that voice and style. And then asking yourself also, who might your audience be? Are you primarily thinking about writing to your friends and family? Are you thinking about writing to other people in the writing, journalism, science community? Or are you really trying to reach a general audience of people who may or may not know very much about whatever it is you're writing about? So that's been definitely one challenge for us at the Microdose. So the psychedelics world is huge right now. So you've got the folks who have been involved with psychedelics and the underground since, the 60s and 70s, like folks who have been around for decades and surely know way more than me about the history and been following it for a really long time. And then you've got folks who are newly interested in psychedelics as a potential therapeutic device. People who maybe read a piece in the New York Times or some other news source last week and are really curious about it and have subscribed to the newsletter because they want to keep up with the news. So trying to find that balance of how do we keep this fresh for people who have been thinking about this for so long, versus also trying to keep it accessible for people who aren't already experts in it. It can be a really tough balance. But as you're thinking about developing your own newsletter, it might be worth thinking about, well, am I trying to target a specific audience? And of course, there's no right or wrong answer there, but it will probably give you a better sense of what kinds of things you want to put in the newsletter and the kind of tone you want to take if you have some kind of idea of the kind of audience that you are trying to target. Another thing to consider, you can either do this at the beginning or maybe after you've actually launched things and have a better sense of, what the voice and the content of the newsletter might look like. But one thing that I would recommend thinking about is having an editor. So for Do a Thing, when my friend Shannon and I were collaborating, we would edit each other's work, which was very nice as a trade-off. Just not only for typos, but also for just someone else who might share, who understands what you're trying to do with the newsletter, who might be able to help steer you away from major misunderstandings, and just correct little things and facts, just to be like, maybe you should double check how to spell this person's name even. So if you're doing kind of a more personal kind of newsletter, I know that at least one of my colleagues, some of you might know Kat Eschner's work, she has a newsletter, and I think for a while she had an editor. She had guest editors come on and read through her work before they were posted. And I know she found that to be a fruitful process. And I will say that for the Microdose, I mentioned my editor, Malia Wallen, is just invaluable in so many ways. She catches everything, but also just is able to be someone outside of my head, to be like, I think you do actually need to explain this further, or even I think you need to write out, this acronym before you just throw it in there at people because people might not know what that is. So if you can either afford to pay someone, if that is something that you are considering doing, like starting kind of your own little enterprise around your newsletter, or even if you just want to maybe swap favors with a friend or someone else who has a newsletter, just trade off editing each other's work a little bit. I think it will give you some peace of mind, and I'm sure it will actually improve the final product. So thinking about that earlier in the process is nice because you can build that in a little bit more, but I know not everyone is in a position to think about, having that extra layer of both time and potentially money, if you're thinking about paying someone, might not be the easiest thing to think about at the beginning. So I know folks have changed their policy over time to include editors. So another big question I'm sure that some of you have is what platform to use. So I feel like I'm going to talk about 4 major ones. There are a ton now. I'll point out also that I'm on some email lists that are literally just someone has taken their address book and they include everyone on BCC. So you don't even need necessarily a fancy platform on which to send out those emails. You can do it the old school way if that's really what you want. However, it is nice to look at these different platforms because it makes it way easier for people to subscribe and unsubscribe, and just less work for you overall, streamlines the process. So the first platform I ever used was Tiny Letter, which I believe is now owned by Mailchimp. So Do a Thing was on Tiny Letter. And the benefits of Mailchimp, it's free up to a certain number of subscribers, and there are fees after that. I do not believe that there is currently a way to monetize a Mailchimp newsletter. Correct me if I'm wrong, if any of you have looked into that and found otherwise. But Mailchimp seems like it was started really as a tool for individuals or companies who were looking for that one-way relationship. Like, I'm going to send out my newsletter instead of trying to get money back from those people. I know Review is another platform that was recently acquired by Twitter. I personally do not subscribe, or have never actually subscribed to a newsletter via the Twitter embed. I don't know, maybe you all have, but putting it out there, I think that one potential benefit of using something like Review, and I think the reason why Twitter acquired it, was hoping that there would be some synergy between the newsletter platform and then also being able to have it directly linked to your Twitter. Maybe that pans out for some folks. I will say I have not seen a ton of kind of extra traffic coming people's way as a result of that. Again, grain of salt, that's just my experience. Another popular one right now is Ghost. So I think Ghost is kind of seen by a lot of newsletter folks, as far as I can tell, as kind of the, what is the best way to put this? Maybe the least contentious option. It is free to use. I don't believe there is a limit of the number of people that can be subscribed. It feels like it is this ethereal presence, hence the name Ghost, where it kind of lets you get your message out there, but doesn't seem to take too much from either party. It's just kind of a messenger for you. And maybe that's what you want. And then the last that I'll talk about, you've probably heard about Substack. Substack has a lot of positive things about it in terms of how easy it is to use. And I think it is smart that it has tried to build a community around certain newsletters. So if you are familiar with Substack, you know that people can heart your posts, they can comment. There's a whole system kind of built around also Substack users recommending newsletters, or you can find new newsletters via the Substack homepage and through looking at what other newsletters a user subscribes to. So if you find a newsletter you like and you're like, oh, who writes that newsletter? Okay, well, what other newsletters are they following? That could be kind of a way to be discovered, or for you to discover a new newsletter. The downside, I will say, if you have not been following it, Substack has also been a platform used by folks with a lot of extremist views, things that I personally politically do not agree with, but they have, been very vocal about free speech on their platform, kind of in the same way that I feel like Elon Musk has been talking about free speech on Twitter, where they are making it pretty clear that they will not be censoring or removing people from the platform for posting things that many people find abhorrent. So that's a grain of salt there, if that matters to you. It's something that I definitely feel conflicted about, having used Substack quite a bit. So those are kind of the big options. I'm sure there are others. If you know of any, put them in the chat, and maybe that will help other folks explore their options. Okay, I guess before I move on, I was going to talk also a little bit about more nitty-gritty details, and also get into some examples that I like. But I feel like I've been talking for a super long time. So if do folks have any questions about what I've said so far, or just questions related to anything that's come up yet?
I have a question. When you were mentioning finding the personality or style of your newsletter, especially for, do a thing and who cares, did you kind of decide your newsletter voice beforehand, or did you develop that voice kind of while you were doing the newsletter?
Yeah, I feel like it's gotta always be an organic thing. But I do think that even just having an idea of like, okay, I'm gonna let myself be voicey here, is a good decision to be clear with yourself about. Otherwise, you might be kind of wrestling with all of the different tones you could take. I think for the do a thing, Shannon and I already had kind of gotten into a rhythm just through our own conversations with each other, where we kind of settled on this, each of our voices, like wanting to share a little bit about ourselves, but also trying to be pretty straightforward with information or actions people could take. And I feel like for Who Cares, I went into it knowing that I wanted to experiment with like kind of forms of essay and musing. So I kind of knew that I wanted to take a more liberal, like literary type of voice than I usually would write with in my journalistic work. But of course, the actual, how that actually comes out is very much an organic process. But I think, yeah, just going in with the idea can be helpful.
Hi, so I'm wondering how you would recommend we go about thinking about length of newsletters and frequency that we send them out with. Because in terms of frequency, I know like with the newsletters that I'm subscribed to, sometimes the more frequent they come, the less likely I am to read them because they just pile up. Whereas if they don't come frequently enough, I might forget that they exist. And they might not be as timely when they do come. So what are your recommendations for that, as well as how that plays into how long each newsletter should be?
Yeah, no, that's a great couple of questions, and I was just about to talk about that. So maybe I'll just jump into that. But maybe before I jump into that, do folks have other questions, things they want to talk about? Okay, I think we'll also, have plenty of time after I get through all of my little spiel that I wanted to get through. So yeah, maybe, okay, that's a great place to start. So Scott asked about length and also how often to update. I feel like that all kind of falls into what does the actual thing that gets sent out look like. So, we talked a little bit about thinking through these big picture kind of philosophical ideas about what you want to get out of the newsletter. what kind of content you might want to put on it, where it might go. But now, say you've picked a platform, you have an idea of what the newsletter might contain, like what is each issue actually going to look like? So I do think that I would really consider you all to think about the visual aspect of things. I think often people think about content of newsletters as being the writing, which is obviously very important, but thinking about how people actually open emails and read emails, as Scott is alluding to, is really helpful to make sure that your newsletter might be something people actually want to open every week and read through. You've probably had the experience of getting a ton of emails that are just a ton of text, and it feels daunting because you've got like 6 billion other emails in your inbox where you're like, I don't have time to read this newsletter for fun. Like I have all this other stuff I need to respond to. So here are the things I would recommend. One, I would really recommend having a header. I don't do this for who cares. I maybe should have, but I've realized that is actually a common theme in many of the newsletters that I like, is that they can immediately open the newsletter and be like, I'm here, I'm where I need to be. I recognize this logo. It feels like an old friend. And that was one really nice thing about working on the Microdose. We actually got to work with an illustrator who created custom logos and even line breaks for us to use in the newsletter. I know not everyone will have budget for that, but I mean, I've seen some very low budget, even hand-drawn stuff that I feel like is really charming, and could be in another way that you can show your personality and kind of make your newsletter a little distinctive. In terms of length, Scott, I think you're right on the money. Shorter is better. Like, I really feel like you start losing folks if you are going over, I don't know, 700-800 words. So we really try and keep things short when we can. Obviously don't succeed at that every time, but at least I think thinking about this the same way that you might think about writing a breaking news piece, if anyone here is a journalist, is a good way of going about it. So you want to kind of get your most important stuff up top, because that is what most people are going to definitely read. And then from there, you will probably be losing folks. I'll also say that one thing that can really help with that overall retention is having sections and line breaks and photos, really just anything to break up that wall of text and to give people an idea of where they're going can be really helpful in keeping them. I know, at least for me as a reader, when I see things broken up into sections, like say, you've got a newsletter where you're talking about 3 different topics, instead of just having it kind of one big ball of text, just throw in a bolded, larger text kind of headline for each, so that if folks do decide, hey, these 2 paragraphs about this one thing are not that interesting to me, they can just move right along to the next thing, and they might actually read more of the newsletter. Another thing to point out, just in general, I have found that through looking at stats for the Microdose, that people really don't click links. So that's just an unfortunate reality, but something that you can maybe try to plan around yourself. So for instance, if you've got a link roundup at the very end of your newsletter, just know that, people might read what's there. They're very unlikely to click. So, and then, yes, the other question Scott asked is about how often do you want to update? I think there are a lot of things to consider here. One is definitely, what do the readers want? But 2 is, what do you want? What kind of time are you willing to or able to put into this? So I think this goes back to some of the questions you would likely ask yourself at the beginning, which is, what do I want to get out of this? What does success look like for me? But consider just the balance between how much time you want to spend each week on work that pays you versus work that does not pay you, because I would say 9 times out of 10, the newsletter is not going to be your cash cow. I would say for most people, newsletters are kind of a passion project or a side project. Sometimes they'll take off enough to actually bring in some money for folks, but for the most part, especially at the beginning, it's not going to be something that you're actually automatically making money off of. So that might be something that drives your decision about how often to update as well. So for the microdose, we update twice a week. We have 2 different kinds of features. One is a Q&A with someone in the psychedelics field that we think is doing interesting things. That comes out every Monday. And then every Friday, we do a roundup of news in that general psychedelic space. And that, I will say, takes up a fair amount of my week, even though, the roundup is sometimes original reporting, but a lot of the time, pointing people to great stories or new studies that have come out. It still takes time to kind of think through what we want to include. For the Q&As, it takes time to email people, schedule a time to chat with them, actually interview them, and then transcribe and package everything into an actual post. So something that posts twice a week actually already feels like quite a bit of a lift. I will say that I'm very lucky that because the newsletter is supported by UC Berkeley Center for the Science of Psychedelics, I get paid for those newsletter posts. That will very unlikely be the case for folks who are starting your own newsletter, unless you've already kind of got backing for it. It's very difficult to guarantee that you're going to make any money off of that. So twice a week feels like a lot, I guess, is what I'm trying to put out there. I know some folks do a weekly post. I think, again, that goes back to if you think that jives well with what you want to get out of it. If you feel like it would be somehow personally or professionally useful to you to hold yourself to a weekly publishing schedule, great, you can do that. I will say, though, that in general, as a reader, I don't really notice that often, like if someone misses a newsletter, I don't necessarily think to myself, oh, it's Thursday, so-and-so is supposed to send an email newsletter out. Like, the beautiful thing about a newsletter is because people have subscribed, it just magically appears in their inbox. And perhaps they'll just think, if you didn't update one week, that they missed it, or that they're off the hook for having to read one more thing. I will say there are very few newsletters that I look forward to reading every week, because I think often a lot of them do update so often that it feels overwhelming to keep up with it. So I think finding that balance can be difficult. But I found that there are plenty of newsletters that I still really love that update on not a very regular schedule, or that update, maybe twice a month. So don't feel beholden to having to be on some kind of regular publishing schedule if that doesn't feel like it's right for you. And if you don't have time, like, basically, I don't think anyone's going to notice besides you. And you can even be upfront with your readers saying, hey, like, welcome to this first issue, or even just, in a little thing in the bottom being like, I send out updates when I want to send them out. And this is especially true if you have a newsletter where your goal is to keep people updated on what you're doing or what you're thinking about, or on some project that you're working on. So for instance, I have a few friends who are writing books, or after they wrote their books and were in kind of the book promotion process, created newsletters to tell people about where they were going to do a book event, or to share some piece of writing that spun out of the book. In those cases, those came just incredibly irregularly. And that was totally fine by me, because the people who subscribe to your newsletter are doing that because they just want to know what you're up to. Might be different if you're trying to, stay on some kind of specific beat. I feel like the most the best example of the second point too, some of you might be familiar with Emily Atkins' Heated, which I believe used to come out every single day until a few months ago when she wrote everyone and was like, I am really burnt out and I cannot do this every day. And I think that was a really healthy move. I know that her newsletter was huge. It had a ton of subscribers. I'm sure it was bringing in a fair amount of money for her, and it must have been a difficult decision to take a step back. But I think at a certain point, she was burnt out, but also readers probably were not reading every single newsletter. If you send something out that often, I think it's really hard for people to keep up. So just do not feel pressure to update all the time. I think at this point in our digital society, quality is definitely more important than quantity. And I don't think anyone is gonna be upset if they get one really great issue from you every month. People will not forget you, especially if they're subscribed. They literally can't, because they'll get your emails anyway. Last step, I feel like you might also want to think about how you want to share your newsletter. It's an email list, so obviously people could manually request that they be added to your list. But with everything going on in the world and online, it's pretty unlikely people are just going to like organically stumble across your newsletter on the platform. So thinking about how you want to get the word out. Social media is kind of the obvious first step. I feel like people often tweet links to saying like, hey, I've started a newsletter, subscribe to it. One benefit of using something like Mailchimp or Substack is that often there is a just rooted URL where you can link to each issue too. And I found that one really effective way that people often will drum up more readers for their newsletters, if they mention other people's work in it, tweeting about it and tagging that person in it is a really great way of getting not only your built-in audience to know that this newsletter exists, but also giving one more opportunity for it to reach a different set of audiences through people whose work you've mentioned and tagged. I found that also sometimes it's nice to just post little snippets on either Facebook or Instagram. I know Facebook feels like kind of a dying platform right now, but now that Instagram lets you include links to things in stories, that could definitely be an opportunity to just get your friends and family at least, and other folks who might follow you if you have kind of a more professional account, to just know that you have a newsletter. And some people I've even seen have just written to people that they know in an email, BCCing everyone and being like, hey, no pressure, I have a newsletter, just thought I'd let you know if you want to subscribe, here's how you do that. I would appreciate it if you told other folks you thought might be interested. But I feel like that word of mouth network is often underestimated and can be really useful. And I really hate self-promotion, honestly. But I think in this case, if it's something that you're working on that you're excited about, the people in your life who know you professionally or personally will probably be happy to hear about it. And I think the key is just to try and do so in a polite and not too forceful a way. Send one little email, post about it sometimes. Maybe don't try and inundate people all the time with the fact that you have a newsletter, but walking that line, I think, will also potentially open new doors as people subscribe, and then that kind of snowballs into people that they know subscribing as well. So I'm going to show you all some examples of newsletters that I like, and what I like about them, in case it helps you think through what you might want to do with yours. So here, let me share my screen. You would think I'd be faster at this by now, but somehow I'm
None of
not.
us is.
Okay, so here is one that I really like. So Shangri-Logs is a newsletter written by Kelton Wright. Strangely, I know Kelton from our days of being on Tumblr. But Kelton is a writer. She has, I feel like, worn many hats, and I actually at this point do not know what her day job is, but she recently moved to a mountain town high in the mountains outside of Telluride, Colorado. They bought this cute little cabin style home. They're fixing it up, hence the name Shangri-Logs. And she's been writing a lot about just her life up there, and also some of the natural history and just the history of that place. It's really hard to put Shangri-Logs into a box. It feels like there's some amount of, reporting and research, but there's also a lot of Kelton in it. So it feels like a nice blend of informative, but also personal. And I think, so this was actually a post that of hers from a month ago. Yes, about a month ago, about beavers and her encounters with beavers near her home, and just a little bit about fun facts about beavers, essentially. So other things I really like about this newsletter, it's one of the few that I actually read every single week. It comes out Sunday morning, and it's lovely if I'm not traveling over the weekend or don't have weekend plans on Sunday morning. I'll sit with my coffee, and it's just a lovely little thing to read. It's generally not super long. It's just long enough to feel like I have gotten a nice essay, but I'm not, feeling like this is a long read and I'm exhausted now. So I think this is a great example of a logo and some visuals that don't seem like, you would have to have like a designer to come up with, but do give a bit of a visual brand to the newsletter. And I will say this is the free version of the newsletter. I know Kelton also does extras for paid subscribers, just $5 a month, where she just kind of it's all on the same types of themes, but she just has a little bit more content if you have a paid subscription. The last thing I'll say about Shangri-Logs that I think has been really effective for Kelton is that, one, she also has an Instagram account that is associated with this, and two, on her personal Instagram account, she will often include little teasers on Friday or Saturday about what Sunday's newsletter is going to be about. So for instance, I think she posted a picture of a beaver on Friday or Saturday before it. And I was like, oh, I'm definitely interested in reading about that on Sunday. Again, I do feel like I'm not necessarily the most average reader of Shangri-Logs, since I know the writer a little bit already and have already kind of been interested in this person's life. But I do feel like if you're thinking about audience, that is probably going to be a lot of your natural audience are people who already know and love you and know of your work and want to know more about what you're up to. So thinking about how to connect with that audience can be really helpful. And I think Kelton does a great job of that. Okay, so the next example I'm going to talk about Lizzie Wade's newsletter, which is called the Lizzie Wade Weekly. I feel like Lizzie's newsletter is almost the opposite of everything I've just talked about, but I wanted to mention it because I think it shows how there's no one way of doing this effectively, and people are going to like or dislike your newsletter based on a lot of different things. So Lizzie has no logo. She often does not include photos. Lizzie updates, I would say most every other week, but she has admitted that she's kind of sporadic about it. Mostly she updates when she has an idea that she really wants to talk about. And I think that really comes across in a lot of people's newsletters. You can kind of tell when someone's phoning it in. They're like, I've got to send this thing out this week. But all of Lizzie's pieces are very clearly something she's passionate about in that moment and is really dying to write about. So this one I really liked. It was about warming up to start writing. Most people don't think about having a warm up. You're just supposed to sit in front of your computer and start writing. But she also, I thought, did a really nice job of bringing in her audience. So at the end of this piece, she asked folks, what is your warm up? And then in the following newsletter, included people's responses and typed up a little bit about, like why that might or might not work. So yeah, this, despite everything I've said about like breaking up the text so that people have an easier time reading, like all of these visual elements, Lizzie does none of that, but she still gets me interested in reading her newsletter every time I see it. I think Lizzie's is a great example also of having a goal that is just personal edification. So I know Lizzie personally, so that's one more bias of mine, but again, I think that's often going to be your audience. But she's been like, I have no interest in monetizing this. I just write about the things I care about. It's mostly my friends and family. I don't have like a zillion subscribers. It's just a place where I exist and I feel glad to be writing in. And I don't want to burn myself out by, holding myself to some kind of lofty goal. So that can work really well for you. And you'll have a loyal group of people who read your newsletter. Okay, another one that I really like. If you all are familiar with Johnny Sun, how to describe him if you don't know him? He's a writer. He's also a TV writer. He writes these beautiful essays. He's also an illustrator. Anyway, he's just like multi-talented person. But Johnny has this newsletter called A Small List of Knowable Things, where he does one cute little illustration and he writes maybe a paragraph or two about this thing and why it's important to him. And I thought so that's another newsletter I will open every single time because I know it's going to be short and sweet and not a heavy lift, but it's going to be something that I'll most likely like because they kind of all fall under this theme of, oh my gosh, what would even the theme be? It's just observations about tiny things in life that you might not otherwise spend time to sit down and write about, but Johnny spends time to write about them. I wanted to highlight this post because I think it does embody a lot of the things that work about newsletters. So he's got this visual element. It's just this nice little illustration that is the center of each post. He always keeps it short. And then in this case, I think it's a really nice tie-in to some of his other work, where he mentions that his book, Goodbye Again, which I think I have on the shelf behind me, came out a year ago. And this was a way to kind of tie something into the rest of his work. And I think that that can be a nice strategy. If there is something that you have worked on that you can kind of iterate on in your newsletter, trying to connect those can be nice. Okay, and another great newsletter, the Science Writing News Roundup, which is by Marianne Lemus. That is, I feel like it's very different in tone and in content than the last three newsletters I talked about, which all feel a little bit more personal and literary. I feel like this is such a great, it says right there in the name, roundup of a lot of the news happening in the science writing community. And I think there are lots of great things Mariana does to try and build audience. Well, one is obviously just doing an excellent job of curating and combing through, like knowing exactly what the goal is here. Like she has really stuck to an informative title for the newsletter and then breaking things down in a way that really helps people find what they need out of it without having to read every word. So these headings, I think, are really effective. I've seen people often use emojis as part of their headings as well, or even in the title of their newsletter, the title of each issue of the newsletter. And that can help people kind of orient to what themes they might see I personally have not used that strategy, but it does seem to be a common and popular one. But yeah, I mean, I think that this newsletter serves a very specific purpose and does an excellent job at fulfilling that. People know what they're getting right up front. It comes out regularly. You know, she does the curating work, and here it is. Okay, and the last one I'll talk about is a more kind of reported newsletter. It's called Garbage Day. Ryan Broderick used to be a reporter at BuzzFeed, and Garbage Day is about the internet at large and a lot of the weird and often awful things going on the internet that you might not have been aware of. Ryan keeps track of them, so you don't have to, essentially. This is an example of a newsletter that I feel like honestly comes out too often for me to read every issue. I think it comes out maybe 2, even 3 times a week sometimes. And I think the reason is that there's a lot to be talking about. I think Ryan does a nice job, though, of balancing voice with reporting. He really excels at telling you what's going on in a weird niche space on the internet, or explaining the latest weird thing that happened online, but is always keeping his audience in mind, trying to explain enough that if you're not following it super closely, you understand why this is newsworthy, but also sprinkling in enough kind of analysis and voice to make it funny, because ultimately a lot of this weird stuff that's happening online, it's dark, but it also is a little bit funny. And I feel like a lot of the time folks who are reading Ryan's newsletter kind of get that from the way that he writes about things as well. Like, you're coming for the information, but also for kind of his take on it. And I think that's often what you'll find with, if you do want to do a kind of semi-reported newsletter, people are looking for your opinion or your views on it. And I think he does a nice job of injecting that into the newsletter without it being just one big op-ed. Walks that line nicely. And also, just on a logistical note, like, I feel like it is, like, his logo is very recognizable and also gives you an immediate idea of what it might get into. Love to have fun online is a great tagline. So yeah, I think that 5 different newsletters, very different strategies and tones and content, but all that work in different ways. And again, I want to point out that I'm just one person, and like, this weird diversity of newsletters are things that I all really enjoy. So whatever it is that you're making, I'm sure will appeal to many different kinds of audiences. So just, you can do what feels right to you, and I'm sure it will find its way to the right people. All right, so I'm going to stop talking at you all now. And I would love to hear from you all if you all have had personal experience trying to start newsletters, if you all have come across anything you want to talk about. Yeah, would love to just open up the floor.
Well, I'll start just because I want to. So thank you again, Jane, for all of your like great advice and tips. Everyone, just so you know, all the links I've shared in the chat, I will also share in our Slack. So you can, copy paste if you want to, but you don't have to. I did have a question when you mentioned that you read Lizzie's newsletter every time it was published. Is that kind of because like you knew, oh, I'm so sorry, not Lizzie, Kelton. Is it because you knew kind of Kelton beforehand, or because that newsletter comes in on like Sundays and like your Sunday morning is like free,
Yeah, I mean, even when I'm not free on Sunday, if it's on my newsletter, if it's still in my inbox, like later on, I'm like, oh, I didn't read it yet. Like, I'll go read it. I mean, I'm sure part of it is that I knew Kelton a little bit from the internet before, but I think that a large part of it is because it's good. Just, it has a great balance between telling a story, but also having a lot of voice. I mean, because I get a lot of newsletters, even from people I know pretty well. I will admit that I don't read every single one because not all of them I feel like really capture the essence of the person who's writing them and or deliver on whatever it is that they're trying to do. So
I don't see anything in the chat real quick. So I'll ask another one. So the list of example newsletters you gave were, pretty different. When you like subscribe to a newsletter, do you use newsletters for kind of like different things? So like, I imagine, you read Kelton's because you are interested, in their life, in their writing, which is a little different from like the science writing news roundup. And like, I personally use it because, Mariana already kept track of all of these things and I didn't have to. So are there like just different ways that you use newsletters?
absolutely. Yeah, I will also say if you are doing any reporting or research, subscribing to newsletters can just be a great way to make sure that those things are in your inbox for you to do your work. I subscribe to a ton of psychedelics newsletters. And even if I don't read every single word every week, it is actually really helpful to have them in my inbox so that in case I want to search my inbox for a certain keyword, or just kind of go back and be like, oh yeah, what was that thing that happened like 3 weeks ago that I didn't actually read up on that I should have? That can be really helpful. So even if you're not reading them in the moment, it can be helpful to just get subscribed.
Okay, thank you. Does anyone else have questions? Because I mean, we've only got a couple minutes. I'll take the time. You guys know I will. Okay, I have another question. And I guess this is more of like, it's less of like writing a newsletter, but you said you subscribe to a bunch of them. How do you keep those organized in any way, or is it just in the inbox?
Great question. For a while, I have two email addresses, one that's like personal, one that I use more for professional things. At a certain point, I had them all going to my personal inbox and I had them all filtered into a folder that was called newsletters. But then I found that I never opened the newsletters thing. Like basically, unless they are right in front of me, I will not read them. So your mileage may vary. I recommend if it helps you to have your newsletters organized into a folder, definitely set up, say like a Gmail filter to have them all go there. But do be aware that you're going to need to specifically look at that folder in order to keep up with them at all. I know personally, I never look in that folder. I always just forget it exists. So yeah, it could work well for some people, but it does not work well for me. It kind of has to come into my main inbox.
There, I thought that's also where I am with my newsletters. I was, double checking to make sure someone else didn't have a better plan than I did.
No, I don't think there's any brilliant plan. And I mean, I think that's, just a reality of the world too, that too many things to read, not enough time.
Yes, and I think with that, we will conclude this month's mentor chat. Thank you, everyone, again for coming in person. The recording will be put up shortly. And thank you again, Jane, for speaking with our community. We will keep in touch. And everyone, I will post all of the links that Jane has mentioned in the Slack and also possibly on Twitter as well. All right. Thank you so much again.
See you.